his outstanding work in record published work on birds in the Australasia region. And he's also done 2 State of the Environment reports, including this last one, so that's why he's here. Eric, thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to talk today. I did the Coast and Marine theme in conjunction with Dr. Vishnu Prahalad from the University of Tasmania. I first met Vishnu when he was a master's student who came to talk to me about management of Ramsar wetlands in Tasmania. He's now a lecturer at the university, so I'm watching a former master's student going all the way through now to being an academic as well. I also want to acknowledge Chris Rees, who's sitting at the back, and he was just having a chat with Christine about the water quality policies. Chris has been my mentor in terms of coastal management in Tasmania. I've been picking his brains for the last 20-something years to learn from him about what was done before my time and during his time in terms of coastal management in Tasmania. So what I'm going to do today is I've been asked to give a presentation about the Coast and Marine theme in the State of the Environment report. I can't go through the whole thing simply because we did 12 of the 29 indicators, so I'm just going to pick a couple of case studies just to highlight some of the things. I'm going to talk about some of the findings and some of the recommendations and just start laying the groundwork for Lean going forward with the should there ever be another State of the Environment report in Tasmania. And of course there is no guarantee that that's going to happen given that we have 15-year wait for the last one. So I'll just go through. And Jason and I think Christine also mentioned very briefly here, we published the 24 State of the Environment report 15 years after the last one. As Christine mentioned, we smashed out in just over 12 months. I mean, we were the authors were contracted and signed the bits and pieces of paper. And from go to actual delivery of the report into the Tasmanian Parliament was just a little bit over 12 months, which was absolutely crazy when you thought that we had a 15-year gap that we were trying to plug, as well as synthesising whatever had happened along the way. As Christine mentioned, there were 29 indicators across those 6 themes. The themes are relatively consistent, both within, say, the environment reports in Tasmania, but also there's some degree of overlap, there's some degree of gaps in terms of state versus federal State of the Environment reporting as well. So you can see there the Coast and Marine, we did 12 of the indicators that were used, and then other themes, and I believe we've got air talking after lunch, and Christine just talked about rivers and wetlands. The report was prepared in 2 components. There was the one volume, the subject, what we called the report cards, basically a 2-page snapshot per indicator, plus the stuff that the Planning Commission, the synthesis, the introduction and everything else. And then there was the technical reports, or anything between 6 and 16, maybe a little bit more pages, that provided all the technical information, the graphs, the analyses, the references, the bibliography. That's the more substantive analysis that the report cards were drawn from. Both reports are publicly available. You just download the PDFs from the Tasmanian Planning Commission webpage, put them together, and the 2 volumes come up with 666 pages, the number of the beast. So take that if you wish. So Christine's shown this table that I put together in our discussions. So they are the 29 indicators. This is the price you pay for sitting in the back of the rooms. You can't read the 29 indicators. But I think the important thing here is to look at the color coding that I've used for the table, and you'll see that generally, the table is in 3 columns. The first column, can you use this? Yeah, first column here is the actual condition of the indicator. The second column here is the overall trend. I'll have to reduce this. Yeah, there we go. And then the third one is the reliability of the data. How confident are we that the analysis has drawn those conclusions appropriately based on any number of indicators? And so, as Jason mentioned, 10 of the 29 indicators are in good or fair condition. too many, 11 were poor, and then 8, we couldn't actually make an assessment in terms of the condition of an indicator. And Christine's just given some good examples as to why, in some cases, despite having a wealth of data, that we're not in a position to actually make a sensible assessment of the condition of that particular indicator. The second column, which is a flood of red, that's the real concern, that more than half of the indicators were shown at the statewide level were shown to be worsening. Things are getting worse for more than half of the indicators that we used in the State of the Environment report. Only about 20% were stable, only 7%, only 2 of the 29 indicators actually improving. So out of the 29 indicators, only 2 are actually getting better, rather than even holding their own. So it's not a good situation to be. But overall, the data reliability was pretty good. When you look up and down that column, there's some very good, even some excellent, where we had some nice long-term data sets available to us. So in some cases, as Christine mentioned, there are data gaps, or the data exists, but they haven't been analysed in an appropriate manner, or aren't in a position to be analysed appropriately, all the way through to 80-year data sets. When you look at the coast and marine theme, as I said, there were 12 out of the 29 indicators. Half of those indicators were in good or fair condition. So you compare that to the 34% for all of the indicators across the state. The number of indicators that were poor, or the percentages, were similar. When you look at the trends for those indicators, those 29 indicators, about the same number of indicators were in that worsening, that red shading that I showed previously, but 5 of the 12, double the percentage of indicators in the coast and marine theme were stable. So and then the data reliability was good or better. And again, that's simply a function or a reflection of the long-term data sets that we have available to us. One of the data sets that I'll use as a case study, the sea surface temperature, we had an 80-year data set. Makes it very easy to come up with some very confident analyses and trends based on those. So if you look at those stats and reduce that down a little bit more, what we feel is that the coast and marine indicators are actually in a relatively better condition than the other indicators that were used in the State of the Environment report in Tasmania for 2024. Yeah, we have to define it to the State of the Environment report as we're talking about now, and that more indicators were stable relative to the other theme indicators. Twice as many percentage-wise, or the percentage was twice what it was for coast and marine indicators. So overall, we interpret it as saying basically the reliability of the coast and marine indicators is higher, and that they're more stable and they're in relatively better condition than more broadly across the state. So you might want to think, it would be easy to think, and it's actually quite attractive to think, that all is well with the coast and marine theme compared to some of the other indicators that we have in Tasmania. But I'll show you that it's not the case. When you look at that table and reduce the complexity down to a very simple table, you can see there's a very disproportionate assessment of those indicators that are in the fair and poor categories down here. They're down at the bottom end of the condition trend matrix. And as I said, very few are in the stable, where the condition's actually improving, or stable or improving. So there's very much a shift in terms of the analysis or the synthesis of our indicators for State of the Environment into that fair and poor and getting worse situation. So it really does, and I think Jason made the point when he started his talk, that really what we're dealing with is a very dire snapshot synthesis of the State of the Environment in Tasmania across all of the indicators that we used for the State of the Environment report. I think, I can't remember, maybe it was Jason, maybe it was Christine, when we first started talking with the Planning Commission, there was a very keen interest by them to focus the writing, the analyses and the reporting on the period since 2009. What's happened since the last State of the Environment report in Tasmania, rather than looking a little bit longer And many of the authors, particularly those that were involved in biological analyses, said, well, look, we need to look at it a little bit more longer because in some cases the data sets are longer, or in some cases, such as one of the indicators I did for albatrosses, some of these species live for 65 years. It doesn't make sense to just look at the last 15 years. You've got a longer time series and the species actually live longer. So let's make the most of our long-term data sets. In the end, and Christine also alluded to this as well, the selection of indicators that you saw listed there previously and that's in the reports reflect two things. One is data availability. The data sets may be there, but in some cases they're inaccessible. Some of the data sets that I wanted to use for the State of the Environment report don't exist. I wanted to do an indicator on marine mammals for an oceanic island. It kind of made sense for me, as well as doing seabirds. Let's look at marine mammals. There's no marine mammal indicator in the State of the Environment report, simply because the data set are such a dog's breakfast, and that's the nicest thing I can say about it in terms of the so-called monitoring of marine mammal reports in Tasmania. And yet we're an oceanic island. We've got a highway up and down the east coast of Tasmania for humpback whales and southern right whales. There's no systematic recording of that information to track the national trend that we're seeing elsewhere. So in some ways, it's really easy to criticise the State of the Environment report for either what's in it or what's not in it, but it's also, we need to explicitly acknowledge that the gaps that we have in the State of the Environment report reflect what data have been collected. Christine mentioned a lot of the cases that the various data sets that were being used up to about 2009, the funding stopped. There's just no interest since that 2009 report to continue on to maintain those long-term data sets that we have in Tasmania. A point of interest, only 2 of the 12 coastal marine indicators that we used in the report actually were agency sourced. And by that I mean government funded, state or federal or whatever. And that was sea surface temperature, which came out of CSIRO and the federal government, and the Macquarie Island albatrosses, which came out of NRE here in Tasmania. All of the other coastal marine indicators were sourced from researchers such as myself, other researchers, university academics, including in some cases community groups. And the idea that you rely on community groups and volunteers to collect environmental data for State of the Environment reporting is not a sustainable model, in my opinion. These are all my opinions. A couple of case studies just to show you what we did. So sea surface temperature, this is the longest time series data set that we had in the State of the Environment report. We had a data set that spans from October 1944 through to the present day. There's a marine reference station sitting off the northwest coast of Maria Island. It's been sitting there since the war. We've got a really nice data set. The data are collected almost continuously, and so breaking down a very long, very complex data set. When you look at the raw data, and that's the graph here, for every year since 1944 to the present day, you can look at the mean monthly temperatures and you get that cloud of points. But if you blur, you can sort of see there's a general shift slightly upwards on the right-hand side. When you reduce the complexity down to monthly means and you do it at a decadal scale, the data set shows a very clear pattern. So the dark blue line that you can see here, that's 1945. They're the mean monthly temperatures for the sea surface temperature off Maria Island in 1945. The red line is the continuous line for 2022. And you can look at that shift in the mean average temperatures, and as the report said, it's about 2.5 degrees for the winter months, and in the summertime the water temperatures have increased between 3.1 and 3.8 degrees Celsius. So there's almost a 4 degree Celsius shift in 80 years at the one site. And that simply reflects an increased strength and persistence and presence of the East Australian current coming down from the Coral Sea, bringing heat energy from the tropics down to Tasmania. 40 years ago, the paradigm was that the East Australia Current would spin off somewhere around Eden, head towards New Zealand, and then head north again towards the Solomons and form the Tasman Gyre. These days, it's coming down all the way off the east coast of Tasmania, actually now getting temperature signals from the south coast of Tasmania. So we're getting tropical water that we can follow coming all the way down the east coast and spinning off in some cases around the south coast of Tasmania. The world's changing.
So nothing new trend over the...
Sorry?
You're saying that's a new trend that developed over the last 20 years?
Yeah, so if you look at, there's lots of historical stuff now where we're looking at this strength of the East Australia Current, and it's just getting warmer and stronger. And as of 2 days ago, there's a what we call a warm core eddy sitting off Sydney at the moment. It's 23 degrees Celsius off Sydney at the moment. So you wouldn't need a wetsuit or anything, just go swimming, in Sydney, and it's only November.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
It is.
Spring, it's not even summer yet.
No, and that's just it. And so if you, well here, the maximum difference is actually in May. So you've had all the summer months to warm up the water. So you're getting the greatest change or the greatest increase in water temperatures actually occur at the end of the summer when the water's had all that time to warm up over the summer months.
It'll be like Vietnam temperature waters here in the next 40 years.
Oh, yeah.
We're not careful.
Won't need a wetsuit ever in Tasmania. And a couple of years ago, there were reports off the west coast of New Zealand, south, where the East Australia Current went across the Tasman, and they were swimming on the west coast of New Zealand, where the water was 4 degrees Celsius above long-term average. And again, they weren't using a wetsuit, and it was, normally they'd be wearing, thick suits.
Fascinating.
Another long-term data set, we only used a subset of the data set, but the reason I picked this one was we've got data going back to 1950s with the Antarctic Division Station on Macquarie Island, looking at the long-term population trends of albatrosses on Macquarie Island. These are long-lived birds. Many albatrosses, in the absence of human activities, can easily live to 60 to 70 years. The oldest known albatross is actually on Midway Atoll in the North Pacific, and she's 64 and still pumping out eggs. So if you look at the long-term trend, this is just from the 1990s onwards, 1994 to the present day. We assess this one as fair and stable, and if you look at the overall data, they send ranges out every year, count the numbers of albatross nests that you can find, and you've come up with these nice long-term trends. Paradoxically, the reason that three of the species, the biggest decrease is in the wandering albatrosses, because they nest out in the open. They were getting hammered by the cats, rats, rabbits, mice, and everything else on the island. The reason some of these others appear to be increasing was not so much that the numbers were increasing. It was more the fact that they were getting harder to find some of these nests of these birds. And then in 2014, the federal government funded the eradication of cats, rats, mice and rabbits on Macquarie Island, and we saw a change in the population trajectories of the albatrosses, and we're seeing what was a long-term decrease in wandering albatrosses increased, and the rates of increase in the populations of these two, of the grey-headed and black-browed albatrosses, was increasing as well. So there was an immediate response by the albatross populations to the removal of predators on the island. The reason that we haven't used light-mantled sooty albatrosses is that they can't find the nest, because the vegetation has grown so quickly now and recovered so well that it's now impossible to find the nests. And so they're now trying to come up with a new way to identify the trend in the light-mantled sooty albatross nest. So it's one of these things that there's a clear environmental signal, clear biological response to a management action that's reflected in these long-term data sets. And if we had only done it from the 2009 report, you would only have seen that trend. You wouldn't have seen the greater context, if you like, of what's been done on Macquarie Island. One of the indicators that I've been involved in now for many, many years is looking at migratory shorebirds. There are these migration corridors or migration highways around the world for migratory shorebirds. And the one that's shown in red, the East Asian Australasian Flyway, picks up Alaska, most of Siberia, all through Southeast Asia, Australia and New Zealand. Half the world's human population lives underneath that migration corridor, and what we're seeing is a long-term decrease in the numbers and diversity of species that use that flyway. We believe something around about 6 to 7 million migratory shorebirds come to Australia from using that flyway every year, and in Tasmania it's probably something in the order of 30 to 50,000 birds of around about 30 species. We are at the end of the flyway. We are the terminus. We're the last station on that flyway. And what's happened is one of the longer term data sets that we have is the eastern curlew, which is the largest of the migratory shorebirds that breeds in Siberia, flies down to Australia. And we've got data set going back to the 1960s for this species at different parts of Tasmania. But it's very clear the trend that we're seeing for these same species in different parts of Tasmania. The rate of decrease in Tasmania is greater, it's faster, we're losing these birds faster than what's happening on the mainland because we're at the terminus. As the population decreases, the population distribution is going to shrink and the numbers are going to decrease at the extremities. So we're picking up these changes in the extremities before we're seeing the catastrophic decreases on the mainland. So you can think of Tasmania as being a precursor, as I put there, or an early warning system for many of our migratory species that we're seeing all through Australia. Whoops, I missed one. Okay, maybe not. Another group of birds that I've been working on, anyone who's ever been to a beach in Tasmania will have seen little hooded plovers, like little clockwork toys that run along the beach in front of you. Or you'd be familiar with pied oyster catchers. Hooded plovers can live for 20 years. Pied oyster catcher, there's a bird down at Marion Bay. She's 35 years old and still breeding. She's the oldest pied oyster catcher in Australia. We know from all the surveys that have been done, Tasmania supports about 60% of the global population of hooded plovers. 60% of the world's population of eastern hooded plover here in Tasmania, and around about 30% of the global population of pied oyster catchers is in Tasmania. So next time you go to a beach, you think about, well, that bird might have been sitting on that beach for 30 years. These are coastal obligate species. They cannot go anywhere else. They cannot breed successfully anywhere else. And so we already know, and from the State of the Environment Report and other reports as well, Tasmania is already a refuge for these species and will become increasingly important nationally and internationally as we lose these birds on the mainland because of human pressure. Tasmania is going to be their outpost and they've got nowhere else to go. We lose them from Tasmania, they're gone forever. So we think about our resident shorebirds as coastal canaries. Everyone's familiar with the idea of the canaries going into the mines, giving the miners an early warning about the buildup of dangerous gases. So do our resident shorebirds give us an indication of the state of the coastal environment and what's happening. And so essentially they're giving us feedback on the efficacy of coastal management, assuming there is some form of coastal management. And the fact that we're losing our birds suggests that our coastal management regime is not what it could be. So as I said before, it's easy to think about things are doing well with the coast. I expect that if I were to do this assessment of resident shorebirds in 5 years' time, assuming that that's when the next State of the Environment Report would come out, the condition would go from being good to stable to fair and worsening. We're right on the cusp now. As the state is looking to open up the coast for development, more and more people come to Tasmania. There's increased pressure on coastal zones. We're going to lose our resident shorebirds, and that's one way that we can tell how well we're managing our coastal areas. I want to change the way you think about beaches. They're not just beaches. Christine's picked up on some of the recommendations. 3 of the recommendations out of the 16 that were prepared for the State of the Report were specific to coast and marine, and I've shown them in blue here. And then there was 2 that related to all of the indicators that we used across the 29 indicators that we used in the entire State of the Environment Report. So the 2 that dealt with holistic, if you like, broad brush all of Tasmania, was to look at this development, a long-term vision and strategy for Tasmania's environment and develop an environmental data strategy. Christine's mentioned the fact that you've got all these different groups monitoring river quality, water quality. There's all these different environmental indicators. There's no synthesis. There's no capacity for synthesis. When we started doing what we were doing for the State of the Environment Report, in many cases, we were actually doing the synthesis that should have been done by the data collectors. And it just added an increased dimension to what we're doing as well. So there's conspicuously a lack of strategic data collection for environmental issues in Tasmania. Some of these data sets that were used up to 2009 are no longer being collected, or they're being collected by dedicated researchers within the university or government in their own time. Again, you can't rely on volunteers, dedicated researchers and academics to collect data in the hope that it can continue long enough to be used for the next State of the Environment report. I think it's really important that all indicators need to be independent of government. The community needs to be confident that the government isn't just cherry picking the good news story and then forgetting about all those pesky indicators that show that, well, things aren't quite as good as what it could be. It's clear also that the 2024 State of the Environment Report was what I call a bottom-up affair. It was constrained and determined by what data we had available to us to analyse for the State of the Environment Report. Rather than having a broad spectrum of indicators that we could pick and choose which ones we wanted to use, we only had so many that we could use. And in many cases, as Christine said, the data, we started doing something with it, but either we ran out of time or we just, the data weren't in a format or in a capacity to actually analyse these data sets properly. And as I've already mentioned on multiple occasions, you can't rely on community groups and volunteers and dedicated researchers to maintain continuity of long-term data sets. It's an unsustainable model and indefensible, I would argue as well. When you look at some of the coast and marine dedicated indicators, one of them was to prepare or establish more marine protected areas. Well, we've had nothing going in the marine protected area space in Tasmania since the Lennon government had the inquiry into the Bruny bioregion. I appeared before those and managed to get a couple of coastal areas declared as marine protected areas. But when the RPDC, as it was in those days, came up with its recommendations of 14 marine protected areas in the Bruny bioregion, Paul Lennon jumped up and said, we will never establish a marine protected area in the Bruny bioregion, and that killed the whole process for an inquiry into all the marine bioregions around Tasmania. So we had no new bioregions in Tasmania, no new marine parks in Tasmania's state waters, for the best part of 20 years now. And I also while I was preparing for this talk, I came across the Tasmanian Marine Protected Areas Strategy. Again, that's another strategy that's just quietly disappeared into, or let's say under the waves, to be appropriate. Everyone's aware that there's a current review of the Tasmanian coastal policy. At the moment, the government's cherry picking its way through to dismantling a lot of the protection to the Tasmanian coast. This is an article that Laurel Bossy and I Laurel's from the university and I put this together. We smashed it out in a couple of days, getting a lot of emotion into an article, but we followed up on something that Jason mentioned about the fact that we are a coastal society. 85% of Australia's national population, human population, live within 100 kilometres of the coast. In Tasmania, it's 99%. We are a coastal society in every form, and so we have a very special connection in Tasmania to our coasts. We are a coastal society, and many of the submissions that came in about the validation bill, there were over 400 submissions in a 2-week window. Many of them added a particular personal anecdote about why the coast was important to them. And yet the government still tabled the bill 2 days after the close of public comment. There was not a single acknowledgement that there had been 400 submissions around the coastal policy. At the moment, and this is where I get political, Dean Winder jumped up as soon as Minister Digan said we're going to change the coastal policy. Dean Winder stood up and said we're going to support it. Sight unseen. Hadn't even seen the bill or seen what was proposed. He just said we're going to support it. At the moment, Labor's also supporting the revision that's subject to a position paper, changing outcome 1.4.2 of the state coastal policy. It basically allows for inappropriate development in coastal areas as long as the developer has undertaken a risk analysis. It's like, well, okay, great. Needs to do a little bit more than that. And at the moment, we're also seeing discussion around development application panels where the minister can, if a council rejects a proposal, the minister can say, I'm going to set up a DAP and I'll assign who I want for that particular assessment panel. So we're seeing a very integrated, very cohesive attack on our coastal zone. Tasmania's coast is the state it's in now because of the state coastal policy. It's not perfect, but it's been in place for 30 years. It's protected Tasmania's coast from inappropriate development, and we're seeing a very systematic approach to dismantling the protection that we've got on our coast at the moment.
Are you talking like with tourism and that kind of thing, like infrastructure?
Everything.
Everything, okay.
Everything. Everything from wind farms to hotel marinas. Some of you may recall that the Woehler Corporation tried to build a marina canal estate down at Lauderdale. 350 houses and taking up half the bay at Lauderdale. The state government was going to sell the Crown land that was required for that marina development for $350,000, the cost of one unit. And it took community groups, the Save Rails Bay, BirdLife Tasmania and other groups, 9.5 years to beat the Woehler Corporation. That's 9.5 years of my life I'll never get back. But the bay is still intact. But because of the coastal policy, and that bay is still intact. So, yeah, it's not good. Going forward, if nothing else from today, from my talk, you need to recognise that beaches are habitat. For most Australians, people look at the beach and say, what can we do at the beach? What can we do with the beach? Coast is habitat. We've got species. I'm a bird person, so I've been talking about birds, but there's a whole raft of species of what we call coastal obligate species that cannot live, breed, or survive anywhere else. We need to think of the coast as a habitat. The number of people that have told me, oh, there's no way birds can nest on that beach. There's no trees there, mate. It's like, well, they nest on the ground. They don't need trees. We've got a huge, as the population is increasing, so the coastal squeeze will expand. So we're going to see increased human encroachment from the inland side, and we're going to see sea levels increasing from the ocean side, and that's that coastal squeeze. The coasts are going to become increasingly, fragile as a habitat for surviving for, going forward. We're in the middle of an acknowledged extinction crisis in Australia. There's a Senate inquiry that I've appeared before. The final report's been delayed to, I think, April next year now. We're already in an extinction crisis. Everyone says, and acknowledges there's an extinction crisis, but it's business as usual. We're not seeing a fundamental shift in our attitudes or approaches or application of doing anything to protect, particularly, because we're talking about coast and marine, and I'm a coastal person. We need to do more to protect our coast, because otherwise we're going to lose what we have, both in terms of the habitat, in terms of the amenity, and as well as all the threatened species that rely on our coastal areas. Just touch, and unfortunately Phil LaRoche, who was involved with the biodiversity theme, he's not here today. I'm just going to mention his work with the biodiversity theme showed that 50% of Tasmania's currently listed threatened species are coastal and shore taxa. So the coast disproportionately supports half of our threatened species in Tasmania. That's how sensitive the coast is now. It's only going to get worse. And as I say here, based on my work and working on shorebirds now for 40 years, I have no doubt that we are on the cusp of a catastrophic loss of our beach nesting birds and our coastal birds, simply because what we're seeing, the pressures that have been building on the mainland that we've been largely free from are coming across to Tasmania now, and we're going to start seeing a ramping up of development and more people on our beaches as a way of so-called progress, but in actual fact we're going to lose so much. The other thing, just quickly, one of the other recommendations was the collection and analysis of fisheries independent data. There's some questionable relationships, let's say it that way, between the aquaculture industry, the fisheries industries around Tasmania and IMAS. A lot of the funding is for the research and analysis of aquaculture data or whatever comes from the aquaculture industry. So there's a question mark just how independent is the university, is IMAS and some of the researchers at the university when it comes to looking at the so-called independent analysis of the impacts of some of these fisheries. Most people are probably not aware there is a push at the moment, well there's an active program at the moment to develop a marine spatial planning regime for Tasmania. It's being done at the university, at IMAS. Terrific. The Blue Economy, CRC, is involved, the Cooperative Research Centre. They drive the aquaculture industry, the salmon industry and the offshore renewable energy are driving the marine spatial planning regime for Tasmania. And I would argue that's completely wrong. It's vested interest. They're clearly they're cherry picking the sites for them, and then everybody can get whatever's left after that. Not good. And this is harking back to my comment about my comments and compliments to Chris. We need coastal management in Tasmania. We are an island. We're a small island off a bigger island in the middle of the ocean. To me, it's mind-boggling that we don't have a coastal management regime in Tasmania. We have a coastal policy, that's terrific, but we need more. 2006, some of you may remember the National Cooperative Approach to Integrated Coastal Zone Management. Wonderful document, framework, implementation plan, everything was there. Nothing happened. I appeared before the Jenny George inquiry in 2009 talking about coastal management, got all of the people, all the senators and House of Reps people down at Orielton in gumboots looking at birds through a telescope, to talk about climate change. At the moment, every state and territory in Australia has its own set of rules, regs and whatever. You cross the boundary between Victoria, New South Wales, New South Wales to Queensland, the rules change about how the coast is managed. It doesn't make sense. 2011-ish, we put together, there was a group because the government was looking at changing the coastal policy. We came up with this group, the Tasmanian Coastal Alliance, TASCA. We had people from CSIRO, EDO. We had a whole group of people with coastal expertise, put together a package, came up with if you like, a framework to discuss about how we can manage the coast in Tasmania. Nothing happened. That went under the waves as well. And then more recently, Mark Rodrigue, who's now retired from Victoria, he's put together these 10 guiding principles for marine and coastal management in Australia. They would work equally well in Tasmania. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can just look around to the mainland, look to see what's being done elsewhere. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your interest. If there are any questions, I'm happy to try and take them. Unfortunately, a little bit too light in here.
Mentioned. I just wanted to say something because I came on board in 1993. I went and did a Masters in Environmental Studies and joined what was called the Coastal and Marine branch. And at that time, just to paint a little bit of a picture, because, and I think this is important, if you have a group of enlightened politicians and supporting them, a group of enlightened bureaucrats, as we had then, plus various people in the community and the union. You might remember the Rio Convention, which sort of spelled out ecological and sustainable development in 1992.
Sorry, is this a problem?
Well,
No, it's all good. It's all good.
in Canberra and in Tassie, we had some really enlightened people on board in government or influencing government that developed, and I'm talking about coasts here, but it happens in a number of other areas, developed a Commonwealth coastal policy, and in Tassie, we developed the whole resource management planning system based on ecological sustainability. So we brought the environment in with the social issues, in with the economic issues. And our whole resource management and planning system, our environmental management, our planning system, all sorts of acts have the sustainable development objectives embedded in them. And the first cab off the rank for the new possibility of developing a state policy. We thought we'd have dozens of them. But the first cab off the rank was the coastal policy. And I didn't really know what was going on, but my job was to take the draft policy which had been written and steer that through all the government departments and make sure it got through the two houses of Parliament. And then my job, with my little tiny team, no resources, apart from what we could get from the Commonwealth, our job was to implement it. And we set up a State Coastal Advisory Committee. And we could report to what was then the Sustainable Development Advisory Council. So it was really, it was a really interesting sequence of developments over those years. And Tassie was really well set up. But then, the government changed and the Nixon report, anyway, we lost the Sustainable Development Advisory Council. And essentially the attacks on the state coastal policy continued all the way down the line. The only thing is it's very hard to get rid of. There have been many attempts, but it's hard to get rid of. And it's far from perfect. It's far from perfect. It was written in a time when there wasn't a whole lot of, when we were far less litigious in the tribunal and so on around planning decisions. It was written to be taken, for its intent to be taken on board in planning decisions.
It was written in the 90s?
Yeah, this is in the 90s.
It was written in the... Was climate change like a thing in the 90s?
Yeah, climate change.
Oh, yeah.
I was born in 1985, so like in the 90s I was still very young.
Climate change
And
was a big thing.
in terms of like, in the public arena, in terms of our political discourse, like it seems to me...
And the State Coastal Policy, so the first draft, drafted in 1993, talks about climate change, sea level rise, and the need to develop, and also to protect those really vulnerable soft sediment shorelines from major storm events that are going to come through, sea level rise that's going to come through.
We could have had radical action in the 90s to reverse what we're seeing now, but no one took what the government didn't make it a priority for radical. They still perhaps, I guess, because there's an alliance in Australia on like fossil fuels and coal and it's
a big complex picture. I've jumped in here and taken up a bit of space for questions. But I just wanted to explain that because I think we can do it again, We just assume it's all going to decline and go to put. But from that experience, it was people, it was individuals like us that got together and said, Tassie needs to do better.
Susan, a question?
Yeah, it's actually
Eric, could you give us a wrap up?
Yep.
Still on coastal policy, because of course I didn't even know we had one until the controversy about Robbins Island.
Right.
Yep.
And I've read it. I've read the Victorian Coastal Policy, which is a massive document and far more comprehensive.
Yeah.
What I'm failing to understand, and Christine's already made a mention of, sorry, I'm not going to find it in my notes, other policies that appear to have disappeared.
Yeah, the regulatory...
How is it that our EPA would not have known that section of the coastal policy should apply to a wind farm?
My simple answer to that...
Eric,
Yep.
could you respond to that?
Well,
I've got a simple answer to that.
I mean,
All right, simple.
council and to planning.
No,
I've talked about the little coastal and marine branch
Yeah.
that I managed. That sat in the EPA. When I retired from the public service, done many other things since, but when I retired in 2011, thank you, that's about 250 grand in salaries and on costs. We can use that elsewhere. We were disbanded. So there was no unit, no individual even within state government that was actually focused on the implementation of the state coastal policy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
and as a result of that, when the DA went through council and everything else, it fell through the cracks. And so now the validation bill that's just gone through the upper house is now essentially in law, basically means that we're going to see the Robbins Island wind farm proposal and the jetty that will extend 500 metres out from the east coast of Robbins Island will be deemed...
Now it's actually a wharf in the plan.
Well, there's a bridge and a wharf. There's two things. It will be deemed to have been assessed and consistent with the state coastal policy, even though it hasn't. That's the whole purpose of the validation bill.
Last
Can I
question.
ask just one general question really quickly? You're speaking to a room of engaged people, right?
Yep.
Obviously, we've chosen to spend our free time here and we're engaged and we care about the climate. The challenge is making the everyday Australian who is not having the climate front and centre, how do we get them to value share that value so that we can actually put pressure on government, because change will only happen if the government is pressured by the consensus across the nation that we need to look after our ecosystem, our coast, etc.
All right, so,
Before you respond, can you put your question in and big loud voice and then respond to both?
Okay.
I try to be louder. I feel the research is very valuable, and education, we really need education. I'm a professional accountant, but I do have a very good education about environment from you today. And I think the research is very valuable. We should have more audience. I agree with this lady said.
Yep.
The best sentence is, of course, is the research, the science, but the most important is like the wider community to understand your research, so we can make an impact.
And that's why I'm here. I mean, the idea is that when you go home now, you will have different ideas, different knowledge, and different perspectives on the coast than what you did before you walked in today. And you're going to be talking to people, and I'm going to be working with Lean over the next 12 months or so. It seems that as we come up with some sort of structured response and policy around coastal stuff, the whole idea is engagement. I agree. I do multiple talks a month, with stuff like this. I also talk with politicians, when they want to talk to me. I talk to the media a lot. It's always just getting the information out, and it's a case, the really important thing across all of it doesn't matter where you get the information, is consistency of messaging. If one person says this and one person says this, as is the way of the world these days, who are you going to believe? But if everyone's saying the same thing, no one's going to say exactly the same thing, because we all have our different ways of communicating. But if the facts are consistent and the messaging is consistent, you've got a much stronger chance, or much greater chance, of getting that message through.
Yeah, the last one is actually from the border to Russia, and we have a big lake. When my mom was young, they can eat the shrimp from the water straight away, because there's no human interference. But now we even couldn't see the shrimp.
Yeah.
And I just feel so frustrated, like the government and the sentence couldn't be honest, work together. I got some Japanese heritage as well, but I feel so ashamed, like the war on nuclear plant several years ago, and the water, because I can read Japanese, but I don't know if the Western world know what they did. The nuclear waste or just get into the sea. Now they put into the sea. So many years later, because water is international issue, the water will come to Tasmania, and can we still have sushi or seafood?
Okay, Eric, thank you.
Pleasure.
Fold lunch in 2 months, so you don't have to create one. Lean is not a profitable organisation, I can tell you. We do it on donation.